Hey, US2, this is your teacher, Mr. Kuzma. I just wanted to give you a couple notes of the things we've been reading and writing about. Um, this will be, I guess, titled Episode 1, and you have to forgive me for my uh, non-professionality here. This is the first time I'm really doing this, and I'm sure it's the first time for you guys to kind of have video lectures like this. But I'm going to make these short and sweet and try to get out as much information as possible. In what would normally be, I guess, a lecture that I would do. So for the course itself, I would usually start with around World War One. I don't think for US One you guys really complete World War One, and frankly, I think it's one of the most important events in modern world history. So usually I start with World War One, but being that we're in kind of an interesting situation, we are going to skip World War One, or you're going to skip the 1920s, which was a amazing decade for the United States when we're talking about economic prosperity, military prosperity, cultural prosperity, as it's the Jazz Age, as it's known. But we're going to continue with the end of the 20s and get into the Great Depression. So you guys had an assignment talking about what some of the causes of the Great Depression were, and as many of you noted, a lot of it had to do with buying things on credit. So buying things on credit means you don't have the money at that time, but in the future you will, so you'll be able to pay that off. So it's kind of a situation where you're paying a little bit of money in a short amount of time, and you'll be able to pay off the whole expense later on, right? So we're pushing things in forward. We're saying we won't pay for it now, we'll pay for it later. And that is a big part of this. Now, what were people buying on credit in the 1920s? Well, it's incredible because we have a lot of new inventions that are being made. We have the automobile that came out, not microwaves, but toasters and radios and vacuum cleaners and things like that that are really new to the American experience, American culture, are being sold. So not only are we buying household items and goods on credit, we're also buying stocks. So what are stocks? Well, when corporations are created, they can become public, meaning that you, as a public individual, can own a portion of a certain company. So, for instance, I have mutual funds. So it means I own a very small amount of like Coca-Cola or Walmart or Disney, whatever it is. You can own a small amount of it and still have a say in what that company does. People in the 1920s were buying stocks very cheap. It was called on margin. And buying stocks on margin meant that you only had to really put forward about 10% of the stock's amount in order to get the full stock, the full share. So let's say a share was $1. You could get it for 10 cents. And the stockbroker, the person who sold it to you, would cover that until they needed that money back. Now, the thing is, the stock market was doing so well in the 1920s that so many people were doing this. Stockbrokers were like, yeah, of course we can do this. We can afford that. But as the 1920s wore on, and the difference between a bull market and a bear market, a bull market being one that is extremely good, a bear market is one that is not doing too well. Most of the 1920s were a bull market, so stockbrokers were like, hey, listen, we'll give you a lot of money to buy these stocks because it's going to do well, and they felt comfortable with that. But as things began to take a downturn in the 1920s, those stockbrokers began to call in those loans and say, hey, listen, remember that 90% that I gave you? We kind of need to collect that. And that's where things started to go down. The stocks had inflated prices, which means companies that were like said to be about worth $100 million or something like that were really worth, a fraction of that. So when we have a bubble like this, that bubble is going to burst at some point, and investors investors who were putting money into the stock exchange began to get frightened and said, hey, listen, we need that money back. And they started dumping their stocks, and this leads to a panic. One of the things you need to understand about our financial system is that faith and confidence has a lot to go with it. Our money is not backed by anything. It's not backed by gold. It's just backed by the faith that if I give you a piece of paper that has a 5 on it, like a $5 bill, you're going to give me something back that's worth $5. In essence, our money is really not backed by anything, so it's that faith and confidence that is really important. If you don't have that faith, that leads to what's called a panic, and that's what happens in the late 1920s. And people start dumping their stocks, selling their stocks, and the stock market crashes October 29th, 1929, or October 26th, whichever you want to go by. And that didn't really affect everybody. Not everybody had stocks at that time. It was a small portion. But what happens is, again, people began to get fearful of what was going to happen, and they started taking their money out of the banks. Now, some things we need to know about banks. Let's talk about that real quick. When you deposit your money into a bank, they don't really have your money saved in a vault somewhere. What they do is they take your money and then they lend out your money to other people in the form of loans and mortgages, auto loans, things like that, insurance. Banks only have to have around 10% of your actual deposits in the bank at any one time. So if one person went and said, hey, listen, I want to take my money out of the bank, I don't feel comfortable, or for whatever reason, you could do that. But if everybody at the same time came and said, hey, we want our money out of the banks, it's not going to work. That money's not there. It's out in the form of loans, mortgages, and things like that. So in the 1920s, there was no insurance on that. We'll talk about that later when we get to the 1930s and Great Depression. But if everybody went to the bank at the same time in the 1920s and they try to get their money out, it's really first come, first serve. If you are the last in line, you're out of luck, your money's gone. So this is what we call a run on the banks. This means that people are going all at the same time to try to take their money out, and it doesn't work. And this is going to lead to a lot of banks just closing down. Now, if banks close down, that means businesses can't get loans to keep their companies going. That means they have to lay off employees. That means employees don't have money. That means they don't have money to buy things. If they don't have money to buy things, companies won't be able to sell things, and this just leads to this downward spiral of economic depression. We also have something called the Smoot-Hawley tariff. Now, real quick to explain what a tariff is. A tariff is a tax on anything that's imported from outside the United States. Import means coming in from the United States. Export means that we've created it and we want to send it out to the rest of the world. In order to try and get more companies to build in the United States, we're going to try to make it more expensive for people to get stuff from outside the United States. So I always do this kind of example. Let's say you're making, cupcakes, right? And cupcakes in America are selling for around 10 cents per cupcake, right? Now, in Europe, you can also get a cupcake. They'll send it over here, and it's 5 cents. But we want people to buy American cupcakes because that's going to make American businesses and employees make more money. So we're going to put a tariff on the cupcakes coming from Europe, and we're going to say we're going to put 10-cent tariff. That means they're 15 cents now. That makes it more expensive. Now, they might be tastier, and that can change things a little bit. But let's just say all things being equal, more people will buy the American cupcakes now because they're cheaper. That's what a tariff is. But what happened was, after World War I, the economy in Europe was terrible. They needed to sell as many cupcakes as possible, and Americans weren't buying in them any longer because of the Smoot-Hawley tariff. So this leads to more of a global economic depression, and that, it's all interconnected and it's going to make things worse. And another reason or another cause we could say would be the business cycle. We usually have these cycles. They go in waves where things will go good, they'll go bad. It's like a pendulum swinging back and forth. So again, with the loss of confidence in the economy, this is going to lead to an economic downturn. And these are the causes of the Great Depression. And we'll talk later about how we're going to try and rectify and make better these issues. Hope this made sense.